Right, the outline of my talk actually is as follows there. I'll try to introduce you, and as an introduction, which will be fairly short, I'm going to talk about the path to thresholds, illustrate where we've been and how far we've come, actually, in threshold development. Then I think it's important to know what we're actually talking about, because there are many, the word threshold is bandied about quite a lot, and it's important to be clear about what we're talking, how we define it. And also, I would like to reiterate, of course, perhaps the obvious to many of you, perhaps all of you even, why we do need them. And then, of course, the bulk of the presentation is going to be about putting thresholds into practice. Where are we now, and what are the gaps? And in fact, Claire's already alluded and made to those and made my task somewhat easier, as well as actually mentioning some other aspects which will enable me not to delay the comfort break for you too long. Okay. Right, so the path to allergen thresholds. Many of you will know that actually food allergy actually only became a food safety issue in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. People started to become interested in those, thought they were sufficiently important, sufficiently widespread actually to evoke or require regulatory action. And interestingly enough, well, in 1994, the ILSI Food Allergy Task Force was founded. I chaired that particular task force until quite recently, until my move away from Unilever. And interestingly, I'll just read from some notes I'd made here, that one of the objectives of this particular task force was to determine the feasibility of establishing threshold doses at which allergens will not trigger a reaction in sensitive individuals. And that really does chime with my experience of the time, actually, where the most frequent question I used to get from Unilever colleagues and others actually was, apart from, okay, is this particular food, substance, an allergen, actually, how much is too much? What's a safe level? And unfortunately, I and most others, probably all others, were unable to provide an answer to that second question. Of course, it followed the 1995 FAO-WHO consultation, which many of you are familiar with, which defined the big 8. Then we moved on to ways of characterizing the risk, actually, because it's fine actually identifying the risk. Until you actually characterize it, it's impossible to do anything like risk assessment. And one of the tools that was used for that was an adaptation of the diagnostic procedure, the double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge. What I want to stress here, actually, I don't know whether this has got a pointer. Oops. See whether it's got, yes, it's got a pointer. Is actually the development of a particular methodology, dose distribution modeling. First, its feasibility was actually demonstrated, well, or illustrated actually in a paper in 2002, which collaboration with ILSI actually, as it happens, and a colleague of mine at the time, a statistician. And then the conditions for using that particular methodology were described further in later papers. And then finally, we come to the risk assessment elements here. In 2008, interestingly enough, the US FDA held a workshop, and from which they the Threshold Working Group wrote a report, and which actually supported quantitative risk assessment, so it indicated a clear preference. Unfortunately, that didn't actually lead, in the US at least, to any particular move towards quantitative risk assessment. Their approach was and still essentially remains zero tolerance in that respect. Other key dates were the Vital Scientific Expert Panel in 2011, which reported which actually proposed reference doses, or enabled the Allergen Bureau, rather, to propose reference doses as part of the Vital 2 approach, published in 2012. Same year as we actually, the ILSI Europe Expert Group, held a workshop endorsing those particular views as well. iFAAM started in 2013 and was able to bring many of these strands together into a coherent project to take them forward, take forward the ones that were required. The last date I've put on my slide actually here is in 2016, last June, the June before last now, where an important EU stakeholder workshop was held, which actually supported quantitative risk assessment and Vital 2, and I will talk a little bit about that actually and its conclusions. So moving on, whoops. So what do we mean by thresholds? Well, from a strict toxicological point of view, food safety point of view, it's a dose at or below which a response is not seen in an experimental setting. You can pick that definition out of the dictionary and it's perfectly okay. But there are other ways of looking at threshold. For instance, one can look at it from a regulatory point of view, where I would argue it's an amount or concentration which defines whether a product meets certain criteria, and the 20 ppm limit for gluten actually is a very good example. And those of you at odds with that will know that it's not actually a no-effect level. It's actually a concentration, in this particular case, which actually will protect the vast majority of people against with celiac disease, actually. In terms of allergen management, the threshold could be an amount or concentration of allergen at or below which the risk is acceptable or tolerable. So we come again to this tolerable risk. And it may be lower, actually, than the regulatory threshold for a variety of reasons, because certainly if you're operating a food business, you want to make sure that you actually attain or don't exceed, rather, regulatory threshold, actually, if you're under those constraints. But even if we pick that word, that definition, the toxicological threshold, further apart, we can see that there are different ways of interpreting it. And in terms of dose, for instance, does it actually mean one below which no reactions at all occur? Difficult concept, actually, in some ways. Ideally, it would be that. But that would imply zero risk, which many of you will know is a very, very difficult position to attain. Does it mean no objective reactions occur? Or no severe reactions? Or perhaps even that there are a dose at which there are only allergic reactions do not pose a risk to human health, which actually is interestingly the criterion for exemption from allergen labeling in the US legislation, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, which was passed in 2004. And then again, the question is, how do we get from individual to population thresholds? So you've defined the individual thresholds. How do we move them? Of course, dose distribution modeling is one of the tools. Now, to avoid these particular issues around terminology, we came up with a certain number of working definitions, something called the eliciting dose, ED, abbreviated, what a surprise, to describe a dose that's predicted to elicit a reaction in a specified proportion of the allergic population. Or it could be others. And for instance, ED10 there, as I've written here, describes a dose that's predicted to elicit a reaction in 10% of the allergic population. But for operational purposes, when we're talking about reference doses, we're more likely to be looking, well, we would not be looking at ED10 because actually, although we're not able at the moment to incorporate severity into dose distribution modeling, or at least not effectively, we think that ED10 would not be protective enough. So we're talking more about ED1 or ED5 or the low confidence interval of ED5, in fact. Now, of course, why do we need thresholds? As I said, it might seem very obvious. But actually, it goes back to the one of the first principles of toxicology, which is that the dose makes the poison. And effectively, as food businesses certainly, dose is the only thing that you can actually influence that you can influence, yes. You can't influence the state of health of the patient or what activity of the person with allergies or the activities which they're undertaking which may place them at greater risk, for instance, exercise or something of that sort. So that's the only control. So in order to manage the risk, we need safe limits. Now, when faced with the problem originally, of course, in the 1990s, I mentioned there were no data on thresholds, no data that could be, or if there were data, those data could not be used for risk assessment. So legislators in their wisdom, starting with Codex, actually, which is a sort of quasi-regulatory body, decided to base allergen labeling on presence alone. So basically a hazard-based approach, because they didn't have those data. And that was fair enough. And it largely works. It's been accepted for ingredient labeling. You could argue that it could be refined, actually, but okay, it works, and people are not minded to alter it at the moment. But, of course, as you all know, in all stages of the food chain, you may have sporadic, unintended presence of allergens in varying amounts. And that, actually, it is not possible to be dealt with solely through hazard-based approaches. And one of the big issues, of course, as you know, is when to use or when not to use precautionary allergen labeling, as Liz already referred to. And in a paper which the iFAAM project actually published, we've got this particular diagram, or this particular diagram, which shows the situations where such labeling is helpful to allergic consumers. Now, for a product without PAL and the product with PAL, actually the conditions are the same, basically. The product has undergone a risk assessment according to specified criteria, and the conclusion based on that risk assessment is that the product is either safe and therefore does not require a label, or a precautionary allergen label, or does require one. But unfortunately, you've also got the counterpart, where no risk assessment has been done. Therefore, really, the status of the product, whether it actually has a label or not, is unknown. And that actually is not at all helpful, as you all know, to the food allergic consumer. Now, the benefits of evidence-based thresholds, which were really what we're talking about, is actually that clear and transparent standards will help people with food allergies and their carers to make safe food choices through consistent and meaningful risk communication. And that is the key to what we're trying to achieve. But, of course, for businesses also, they support transparency, for regulators, they support transparency in safety risk management and enforcement decisions by regulators. And a good example, actually, was the use of the Vital 2 reference doses for peanut when, I think it must be a couple of years ago now, we had the issue of peanut in paprika, for instance. I think it was in paprika, or cumin, I can't remember which one, and it was hazelnut in one, and almond rather in one, and peanut in the other. And it would also provide food businesses with confidence in assuring the safety of allergic consumers, and create, thereby, a level playing field in terms of what they need to achieve. And basically, that actually really is summarized in this particular vision paper, which the group at the Food and Drink Federation actually produced 7 years ago now. Gosh, time flies. Which actually summarizes this very well. Improved protection for at-risk consumers. Now, moving on to the bulk of the presentation, what do we really need to put these thresholds into practice? I thought it might be useful to review what we've got against those particular criteria. Well, first of all, defined and accepted thresholds. I mean, we need actually ways, tools to derive them, methods that are accepted, validated thresholds. We also need to define protection goals. We need to be sure about those, and this actually does boil down to this issue of acceptable or tolerable risk, which was the question posed to Claire following her presentation. Then we need risk assessment tools to translate them into practice. And I think we also need a regulatory framework in which to they're used, actually, which is generally accepted. And, of course, and last but not least, we need acceptance by stakeholders, particularly, of course, those who are directly affected, either because they have food allergies or because they look after people with food allergies. So, what do we have now? Okay, don't need to go through that quickly. Okay, defined and accepted thresholds. Let's look at what we've got. You've already seen the Vital 2 reference doses here. I've cut down the table, actually, so you don't see all of it. But those are based on, the doses, the data points actually are based on minimum eliciting doses derived from double-blind placebo-controlled food challenges, escalating dose challenges. The lowest and the data is or the data point actually is based on the lowest amount resulting in an objective reaction, and also on a clearly documented dose escalation regime, so that the interval in which the reaction occurs can actually be precisely defined and modeled. And the tool, as I mentioned before, that we've actually developed to do that actually is a form of benchmark dose analysis, actually, which is dose distribution modeling, and that's an example for peanut, actually, from, I think, if I remember correctly, the Vital 2 reference dose paper, actually. So we've got that. Whoops. Oops. Ah, that's gone fast. No, that's something. It jumped. There we are, yes. And, of course, dose distribution modeling can be used way beyond that, actually, in probabilistic risk assessment models in which distributions not only of the reactivity to the allergens can be used, but also the distribution of allergen contamination within a particular product, for instance. And the output can be used also to set criteria for a particular product to be considered safe. So that's a risk management tool. Now, what about protection goals? A very thorny issue. Again, I reiterate the primary purpose of limits for allergens here is to protect allergic consumers effectively by minimizing the incidence of reactions. And the word minimizing rather than eliminating is very important here, actually, because eliminating, as I would say, again, would mean actually totally abolishing the risk, so zero risk, which is, in a real world, not a feasible option. Of course, this will also protect food business operators if it's well implemented. And it'll do so by providing single consistent benchmarks for allergen management decisions relating to unintended allergen presence, and including, but not only, in relation to precautionary allergen labeling. It'll also foster good practice in assessing the risk from unintended allergen presence. And that is something that we certainly need across industry. We need to be able to talk the same language along the supply chain. And I certainly know from my time in Unilever that we've had very difficult conversations with suppliers over that particular issue. And last but not least, actually, is also ensuring that precautionary allergen labeling, which I think we're going to have for some time, it is a bit unique to allergens, to be honest. I mean, there are a few other examples, but not. But it's really associated with allergens, I think needs to be an effective tool. And actually, at the moment, it actually means that its value needs to be restored and maintained. It needs to be credible to and helpful, therefore, to people with food allergies. Okay. In terms of minimizing the risk, we need to actually take into account a number of factors. And I've tried to summarize some of the, the issue rather than the solutions here. Of course, if you set a reference dose, if you set too high a reference dose, clearly you're not going to protect anybody. It's not going to be very useful very useful. On the other hand, if you set it very low, you might imagine, and at the extreme actually, you set it at non-detect, for instance, you will end up with a considerable number of products affected. And I've certainly heard figures cited, I'm not sure exactly what the value is, around this sort of figure of 75 to 80% of particular categories of products. Problem is, you have the other aspect, which is here, and this is where credibility comes into it, that the observance of precautionary allergen labeling actually varies in the opposite direction. As people faced with a very high proportion of labels, think, well, do not think that it is credible, basically, or alternatively are prepared to take a certain amount of risk, which they judge for themselves, based on criteria which may or may not be good, which have worked in the past for them, but ultimately place them at risk. So what we need to think about, actually, is this particular risk profile. And the skill will be actually in working out where that particular minimum is that actually affords the protection to the most of the allergic population, and for those who are actually perhaps outside that protection, who might experience those a severe reaction, for all we know, below the reference dose, we need to emphasize the element of education, of dialogue with healthcare providers. Because the label cannot actually carry the whole responsibility and the whole way of doing things. Okay, so of course Vital 2 actually has some inherent protection goals. For instance, the ED01, by definition, provides a minimum protection factor of 99%. 99% won't react. But more importantly, actually, the aim that we had in the panel was to protect the vast majority against mild, self-limiting objective reactions which do not require clinical or therapeutic intervention. So inherently with that. Now, up to now, as Claire's mentioned actually, the vital reference doses certainly seem to have protected people they've been applied, and anecdotally, you might say, because there's no report, there have not been reports of a product which has passed the vital standard and not required a precautionary allergen labeling as a result, and provoked a reaction in anyone. So anecdotally, after now, what is it, about 6 years experience of using them, they look safe. But of course, that is not necessarily sufficient. We want positive evidence of safety, and Claire's already referred to the single-dose challenges and described the ones that we have done within iFAAM. This, of course, was the first example, which was in peanut, which was, I think it was financed by FAAP, if I remember correctly, actually. FAAP, of course, were part of the investigators as well. And you can see the numbers involved. 378 clinic attendees with peanut allergy were invited to take a challenge in three different centres in, well, obviously Ireland, Australia, and the US. It was an open challenge, and the dose that was given to them was not the ED1, which actually is the reference dose for peanut, but because that would have required probably, I don't know what the calculations were, probably about 1,000 people or something of that sort. Rather the higher dose, the ED05, which is 1.5 milligrams, which is offered within a peanut cookie. They were followed up. Importantly, there were predetermined criteria for positive response. And according to those criteria, 8 positive reactions were observed. So, as Claire mentioned, this actually validates the ED05. In fact, it shows a value slightly lower than the ED05 for 1.5 milligrams under those circumstances. But the other important point, initially, the whole point of the single-dose challenge was actually to validate the ED05, the dose distribution modeling, actually, or at least a particular point of the dose distribution modeling. But in fact, of course, everybody who was involved and others realized, of course, that it would also provide great insight into the nature of the reactions that people are going to observe under those circumstances, and when challenged under those circumstances, and all the reactions were in a mild category, actually, and did not and meeting the criteria which I showed on the other slide, previous slide. Now, of course, we need risk assessment tools. And I'm going to be able to go very quickly through that because Claire has already covered the iFAAM ones, which are a very important development. But, of course, we have developed tools over the years. And, of course, we've got guidance. Of course, the Allergen Bureau and Vital 2 actually provides a whole series of tools also to, and including a calculator actually, to determine whether a product is safe or not. There is guidance by the Food and Drink Europe, which is a trade association, as you know, for the food industry within Europe. I think it is still only missing the chapter on quantitative risk assessment, which we hope to be able to put in as soon as possible. Yes, Claire's already mentioned the structure of the iFAAM tools, and I'm only going to cover really, therefore, the Tier 1 risk assessment. Tier 1 risk assessment actually is intended to be usable by SMEs as well, not just large companies, although it is useful for large companies, certainly in proposing it, in fact, in the iFAAM project. There's something at the back of my mind too. And the starting points were actually that it would require minimal input from users and also would require minimal knowledge of allergens and so on. And basically the inputs and it should be fast with easy accessible data for first estimates. And the idea is to produce a first estimate. And basically you can put the inputs are the unintended allergen presence, levels of unintended allergen in terms of ppm allergen, but actually that can be measured, but it can also be estimated. You can do estimates if you know something, you need to know something about your process. And yes, consumption level estimates as well, which could or might, but does not necessarily have to be a serving size, as Claire mentioned as well. And the output is binary. Either it tells you your product's fine, and because of the conservatism built into that, it fails safe. And you can go ahead with confidence as an SME, which is important. Alternatively, if you, obviously if it's red, then either you go around the loop of looking at mitigation measures, deciding whether you actually want to do a more refined risk assessment using the Tier 2 risk assessment, or whether you actually have got to the point where actually you're going to use precautionary allergen labeling. But it's not just a tool for precautionary allergen for deciding on precautionary allergen labeling, it's important to say. Next point, regulatory framework. Now, you will hear it often, and I heard it quite recently actually, that there is no regulatory structure around precautionary allergen labeling. To some extent, I suppose in precise terms it might not be, but in broad terms that is not correct. It does have to be, precautionary allergen labeling does have to actually fall within the ambit of general food law and general food safety law. But more precisely, actually, within the Food Information for Consumers regulation, there are provisions which will actually make this, which will actually change this, and for the better. And one of the points actually is that I read here, Commission shall adopt implementing acts on information on the possible and unintentional presence in food of substances or products causing allergies or intolerance. And what does that mean? Well, basically, there will be requirements in place. It shall not mislead the consumer, which is general requirement for labeling anyway. But this is emphasized here, and there are various ways of misleading the consumer, including putting a precautionary allergen labeling when you haven't done the risk assessment, so you have no idea whether it's actually safe or not. So my interpretation of this actually is in blue. PAL should be accurate, its use should be justified. Of course, it shall not be ambiguous or confusing for the consumer. So, unfortunately, we have to lose the diversity of statements that I think we certainly have in the UK or the US. I can't remember what number it is exactly, 50, 60 or something of that sort, and actually be very clear about what we mean. Terminology should be clear and limited to one or a few well-understood terms. And, very importantly, it shall, where appropriate, be based on the relevant scientific data. So it should be based on a thorough risk assessment, in my view, anyway, at least, preferably quantitative. Of course, it's not always possible to be quantitative, sometimes if data are not present. So actually, that's the regulatory framework. Now, in terms of acceptance, whoops, yeah, move, there we are. I just want to relate to this, some of the conclusions, and there were many actually, so I've really had quite a hard task in reducing them to a manageable number, and also without making, well, the slide is still busy, as you'll see. But anyway, just to summarize there were 46 participants with delegates from member states, food industry, patient advocacy groups, and academic scientists. Claire was there, for instance, and presented. The aims of that particular, of the workshop was to deal with this provision of food information to consumers on the observed proliferation of precautionary allergen labeling by food producers. So clearly, DG Santé, as the risk managers, are concerned about this particular proliferation, and they are aware that it's actually not, it's not beneficial to the food allergic consumer. And in their duty to protect consumers, they understand they need to do something. And what, oops, good night. Go back to that. Let's see. Ah, there we are. Nope. I'm pressing too many buttons here. There we are. So the purpose was to identify the sequence of steps required for framing the current use of precautionary allergen labeling information and its enforcement across the EU. So some of the conclusions, and as I say, I had some difficulty actually reducing them to that number. Well, first of all, the one on terminology, simple, easy for consumers to understand, may contain as recommended, and defined conditions and transparent. So that would meet the requirements of Article 36. It was recognized that the benchmarks, the reference doses, needed to balance the degree of protection and safety and choice for allergic consumers. And they do need endorsement by EFSA as an independent scientific authority. Stakeholders also made it very clear that they wanted acceptance by the authorities, that is, of the reference doses proposed by Vital, in the Vital 2 scheme, actually. So that's there are no other proposals at the moment, and they certainly seem to be working. So there was that desire. It was recognized that protein is a hazard and should be the basis of the risk assessment, with the results expressed in units that can be directly applied to the risk assessment. Because one of the difficulties that certainly food business operators have is actually translating what they get back in terms of an analysis or the analytical result to whether that represents a suitable, or well, an acceptable not concentration in a product. Communication, of course, was highlighted as well as very important, but it's clear that users should know what precautionary allergen labeling means, that there are benchmarks, and that it is a way of minimizing risk. And then a couple of points about guidance, actually. Guidance on good risk assessment practice was definitely required. And I say, when I've put here guidance to good analytical practice, it's not necessarily guidance for the analytical labs, or it may include that, but it's also guidance actually to the users of analytical services, those who are actually asking labs for results, for analyses. Whoops. Well, come on. Oh, is that, oops, no. I'll get it right eventually. Oops, right, okay. So I've tried to summarize here. This is the only conclusion slide I have, actually. My score is on what is 1 out of 5, actually. I'm sure you'll be able to disagree, particularly with individual ones. But in terms of where we are, I think in terms of defined and accepted thresholds, yes, notwithstanding, of course, that we are missing, actually, data for a number of allergens, I think we are in a reasonably good state, at least for those, for many of the allergenic foods which have been identified, which have been analyzed in the Vital 2 program, and for which reference doses have been proposed. In terms of protection goals, yes, I think there is still to be done. There is still work to be done there. We need to be clear about what we are trying to do that way. Risk assessment tools, in my view, are in a reasonable shape. I think we have those. The regulatory framework, you will see that I have put brackets between there. It's only once in place that it will become that. I'm not, perhaps 4 is maybe a bit high, because there is one particular element here which Claire referred to actually as well, and that is because precautionary allergen labeling remains voluntary under the legislation. There is a need to inform people on the people with allergies that actually a risk assessment has been done, so they actually can distinguish between the situations where the product is safe or where really it might not be. And that's an issue. Acceptance by stakeholders, I think, yes, we are moving. I think we've made good progress over the years, and I think we are in a place to we are in a situation to put something in place for that. And I think this actually adjusts some of the external bodies that have been involved, or organizations that have been involved in all this work, and from whose work I have taken things. Okay, so thank you very much.